So this whole debate over Gary Lineker's suspension by the BBC over his Twitter comments has resulted in a much wider debate over free speech, the BBC licence and the BBC's impartiality, all of which I'm going to raise some thoughts about in this video. Stay tuned. So ultimately what we're talking about here is the right to the freedom of expression as afforded by Article 10 as against the prominent profile of somebody like Gary Lineker, who's paid £1.35 million a year by the BBC, which is supposed to retain a stance of impartiality when reporting the news. This has resulted in a huge debate over the freedom of speech and expression as against the reporting of news impartially by a state-funded organisation such as the BBC, and whether or not the licence fee comes into play with all of this. Now, some people have raised comparisons with the recent tweet with what Gary Lineker said at the Qatar World Cup last year. So first of all, looking at the tweet itself from Gary Lineker, he said, "There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s, and I'm out of order," he asks. Now, of course, many people have criticised the tweet, saying that he shouldn't have used such language and ostensibly comparing the asylum policy with that of Nazi Germany. But at the same time, many prominent legal figures have strenuously argued that the new asylum policies are quite frankly illegal and break many different pieces of legislation and ultimately renders the policy unlawful. Now, the obvious elephant in the room is the number of people coming to the UK by small boat and the argument as to how many of those have a genuine asylum claim. Now, much of the argument and debate, particularly in comments on videos that I've seen, including mine, is over whether these people are arriving legally or not. Now, as some very prominent lawyers have put it, it's quite obvious and common sense that people arriving by small boat are not going to have paperwork for the most part, and of course are not going to have a legitimate legal means of coming into the UK. But that is not to say, of course, that they won't necessarily have a valid claim for asylum. However, coming back to Gary Lineker, the whole point of this debate is, should he be allowed to say what he thinks, or should he keep his opinions to himself? Now, the whole argument with the BBC is that the BBC remains completely impartial when reporting the news, and therefore if a BBC reporter or somebody ostensibly on behalf of the BBC is expressing an opinion, then that is on the face of it going against the BBC's guidelines. In comparison with my channel here, sometimes I'll give you my opinion, not often, but sometimes I will. Usually I'll try to bring you both opinions, one side and the other, but the BBC doesn't even do that. The BBC typically will raise questions as to, some people might think this, what do you say about that? And other people might think the other, and what do you say about that? And ultimately, impartially reporting the news to you. Now, just today I see a video by GB News, which I'll link in the description below, where Jacob Rees-Mogg has ultimately said that the BBC licence fee should be scrapped and allow the BBC to break free from these rules and guidance of impartiality so that it can report the news in whichever way that it desires.
I have long thought that the licence fee is a constraint on the BBC, that it stops it earning revenues by subscriptions on the iPlayer or by taking advertising, and it leads to a heavily regulated media based around what the BBC needs and what is needed for a state-funded channel. And so, yes, I'm saying the licence fee has passed its sell-by date. It needs to go.
Now, of course, briefly touching on the licence fee, he of course said that you should be paying the licence fee if you watch live TV, so he's not recommending that you stop paying it if you do watch live TV or use BBC iPlayer. But what he has suggested, that if the BBC were to break free from the constraints of the impartiality guidance and rules by which it so closely abides, which has resulted in this whole debate about the Gary Lineker comments, then the BBC might then be able to take subscription fees, advertising fees, and ultimately, in my view, for what it's worth, would be able to grow and expand its operations as opposed to remaining reliant on the licence fees. Now, I for one would probably pay a subscription fee to the BBC, as I know would many of you, but I also know that many of you have argued against the TV licence fee because it ultimately funds the BBC, and you don't feel that it's right that you pay that fee when it applies to all live TV as against the BBC. But again, coming back to the issue of free speech, Gary Lineker's paid £1.35 million a year by the BBC as an independent, as I understand it, rather than an employee. But ostensibly, he is an ambassador of the BBC, and therefore operating within the strict constraints of the impartiality guidelines, ultimately will end up in these debates if and whenever he expresses an opinion such as he has on Twitter. Now, whether you agree with that opinion or not is somewhat irrelevant. Many of you will agree with his opinion and many of you won't. As I said, that's sort of besides the point. The whole point of this is that the BBC remains neutral in the reporting of the news. The obvious reason for that, if I give you the scenario that you are watching the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news, and one of the reporters tells you what you should be thinking because it's their opinion, then they are swaying you as to what you should think. And with Gary Lineker, the last I checked, I think just shy of 9 million followers on Twitter, that's quite the platform. Now, if he is ostensibly quite the ambassador of the BBC, because of his position and the platform that he has there, many of you will agree that he shouldn't be putting his opinion out on Twitter. But at the same time, many of you probably think that he should be allowed to speak his own mind, so long as it's made clear. That's why so often you will see Twitter accounts say tweets are mine, as opposed to belonging to the company or the opinions and views of the company. Now, many of you have probably gathered by now that I'm an ambassador of free speech, within reason, of course. It shouldn't be harassment and it shouldn't be hateful or deliberately threatening. But other than that, yes, I would be in support of free speech. Everybody has an opinion, and maybe you respect those opinions. And those of us that have a platform of sorts, of course, should be mindful of what opinions we put out and upon whom they might have some effect. But ultimately, I come back to the point that we live in a democracy, we live in a free state. You are free to do and to say anything you wish unless there is a law curtailing it. So as regards speech, if it is hate speech and or related to a hate crime, of course that should be curtailed and your freedom to do so should be restricted. But as for your general opinions on certain matters, I would be in the camp that supports free speech, and with regards to the BBC, they would have my full support in breaking somewhat free from these restrictions and guidelines, and ultimately I think it would generate a lot more revenue as a subscription service. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you pay for a subscription to the BBC if it were just that and nothing at all to do with watching or recording live TV as a TV license fee in the way that it's phrased now? Do also let me know what you think about the Gary Lineker debate. Should Gary Lineker and people like him with a platform like his be able to put their opinions out, even though they are attached ostensibly to an impartial organisation such as the BBC? Let me know what you think. This is a free debate, this is a free country, and this ultimately is what this whole debate has been about. Please remember to like this video and subscribe. That helps my channel grow, it helps to push the algorithm, and as always, I thank you for watching.